favorite whipping boy in the Cultural Wars since 399 BCE, when an Athenian jury sentenced Socrates to death. However, philosophers nowadays are seldom accused of corrupting the youth. Instead, a surprisingly wide range of pundits, from celebrity scientist Neil deGrasse Tyson, who said that majoring in philosophy, quote, can really mess you up, to Senator Marco Rubio, who commented, welders make more money than philosophers. We need more welders and less philosophers, assert that philosophy is pointless or impractical. Now, Neil deGrasse Tyson's comment is ironic since he's a PhD, a doctor of philosophy, reflecting the historical fact that natural science developed out of the field he denigrates. Moreover, truly great scientists recognize the continuing importance of philosophy. Einstein even remarked that, quote, the independence created by philosophical insight is, in my opinion, the mark of distinction between a mere artisan or specialist and a real seeker after truth. And he said that in a letter to a physicist who was going to be teaching some philosophy in some of his classes, and he was getting flack about it from some of his physics colleagues, and Einstein said, no, I absolutely agree. Very important for physicists to know philosophy. Marco Rubio's claim is simply inaccurate. Not only do philosophy majors earn more than welders, but they also earn more on average than political science majors like Rubio. In addition, those who study philosophy score at or near the top in admissions tests for law school, medical school, and even business school. One business person who majored in philosophy was even on the stage when Rubio made his dismissive comment. Former Hewlett-Packard CEO and Republican presidential candidate Carly Fiorina majored in philosophy. Although the critics of academic philosophy are mistaken about where the problem is, departments are failing their students in a crucial way. They are not teaching the profound, fascinating, and increasingly relevant philosophy that's outside the traditional Anglo-European canon. Now, ranking philosophy departments is always a controversial matter, but according to one list of what might be considered the top 50 philosophy departments in the US that grant a PhD, only 5 out of 50 have a member of their regular faculty who teaches Chinese philosophy. There are only 3 additional doctoral programs in the US outside of the top 50 that have strong faculty in Chinese philosophy. I'm focusing here on Chinese philosophy because it's my own area of specialization. However, Chinese philosophy is only one of a substantial number of what I like to call less commonly taught philosophies, LCTP. I adapted that phrase from language instruction where they talk about the less commonly taught languages, which are the languages other than things like Spanish and French and German that don't get taught as commonly in language departments in the US. So less commonly taught philosophies is a convenient way for referring to all these philosophical systems outside the Anglo-European mainstream. For example, only 5 doctoral programs in philosophy in the US have specialists in India philosophy. 5. And only 2 of those departments are ranked among the top 50. Only 1 U.S. doctoral program in philosophy regularly teaches the philosophies of the indigenous peoples of the Americas. Most U.S. philosophy departments have no regular faculty who teach courses on African philosophy. Even some major forms of philosophy deeply influenced by the Greco-Roman philosophical tradition are largely ignored by U.S. philosophy departments, including African American, Islamic, Jewish, and Latin American philosophy. Now, in order to appreciate why the narrowness of philosophy departments is so problematic, let's consider one example of the less commonly taught philosophy, is the one that I know the best, Chinese philosophy. Chinese philosophy deserves greater coverage by U.S. universities for at least 3 reasons. First, China is an increasingly important world power, both economically and geopolitically. And traditional philosophy is of continuing relevance to understanding China. Chinese businessmen pay for lessons from Buddhist monks. Taoism appeals both to peasants, for whom it is a part of tradition, and to intellectuals who look to it for a less authoritarian approach to government. And China's current president, Xi Jinping, has repeatedly praised Confucius. Having an informed opinion about the role of Chinese philosophy in Chinese politics and intellectual life is important for understanding China's present and its future. How will the next generation of diplomats, senators, representatives, and presidents, not to mention informed citizens, learn about Confucius and his role in Chinese thought if philosophers refuse to teach him? Now, some of my philosophy colleagues would say, well, they can learn about Confucianism from Chinese-Japanese programs or Asian studies programs or religious studies departments without having to learn about Confucius from a philosophy department. I would remind my colleagues how vociferously they would complain if the dean told them, you don't need to hire a Kant specialist because the German department will teach him. Or you don't need anybody in political science, you don't need anybody in political philosophy because the political science department covers that sort of thing. We know that philosophers ask certain questions of texts and use certain methods for discussing them that are not necessarily practiced in other humanities or social science disciplines. Other disciplines have equally valuable methodologies, but there's no substitute for reading a text philosophically. A second reason that Chinese philosophy should be studied in U.S. philosophy departments is simply that it has much to offer as philosophy. Consider the revelations in just a few of the seminal works about Chinese philosophy that have been published in the English-speaking world in the last few years. Lee H. Yearley started a minor revolution in comparative philosophy with his book, Mencius and Aquinas, Theories of Virtue and Conceptions of Courage, which shows that the concepts of Western virtue ethics can be applied to the study of Confucianism. Yearley argues that the two traditions are similar enough for comparisons to be legitimate, but different enough for both traditions to learn from one another. For example, both the Thomistic tradition and the Confucian tradition have lists of cardinal virtues, the major virtues that encompass all the lesser ones. However, the lists overlap only partially. The Confucian cardinal virtues are benevolence, righteousness, wisdom, and propriety, while the Thomistic list of natural virtues is wisdom, justice, courage, and moderation. Thinking about different conceptions of the cardinal virtues gives us a broader range of possible answers to the question, what is it to live well? Now, many philosophers are doing fascinating work on other aspects of Confucian philosophy. Aaron Klein of Georgetown University compared Confucian and Western conceptions of justice in her book Confucius, Rawls, and the Sense of Justice. More recently, in her book Families of Virtue, Confucian and Western Views on Childhood Development, she developed specific policy proposals based on both empirical data, results of contemporary psychology, and insights taken from Confucian views about human development. My colleague Eric Fitzgable of UC Riverside has compared the philosophies of Mencius, Xunzi, Hobbes, and Rousseau, and this is an excellent article in which he does so. And Aaron Stallnager of Indiana University of Pennsylvania has written this fine book, Overcoming Our Evil, Spiritual Exercises in Xunzi and Augustine. At Duke University, David Wong and Owen Flanagan have taken insights from both contemporary ethics, contemporary psychology, and Chinese thought, both Confucian and Taoist, to give fascinating syntheses of these systems of thought. In addition, some mainstream philosophers have been open-minded enough to investigate Chinese philosophy, including Alistair McIntyre. That's one article in which he talks about Confucian versus Aristotelian conceptions of the virtues, and Martha Nussbaum has talked about golden rule arguments in Chinese thought and what she thinks are the strengths and weaknesses of them. Asian philosophers can also make important contributions to the philosophy of language and logic. For example, most Western philosophers have argued that no contradiction can be true. However, there are a surprisingly large number of sentences that seem to be both true and false. Some of these are sentences in ordinary language, like the liar paradox. This sentence is false, which is false if it's true, or true if it's false, while others are generated by logico-mathematical systems, like Russell's paradox. There is a set that has as a member every set that is not a member of itself, which both does and does not have itself as a member. Now, Asian philosophers have been more willing to entertain the possibility that some statements might be both true and false. Consequently, some contemporary philosophers, like Yasuo Deguchi of Kyoto University, J.L. Garfield at Smith College, and Graham Priest at the CUNY Graduate Center, have combined insights from Buddhism and Taoism with paraconsistent logic to defend dialetheism, the claim that some contradictions are true. This is not the only technical topic on which Asian philosophy anticipates Western philosophy by 2 millennia or more. The ancient Moist philosophers recognized that opaque contexts block the substitutivity of co-referential terms, something that was not fully appreciated in Western philosophy until the 20th century. The third reason that it's important to add Chinese philosophy to the curriculum has to do with the fact that philosophy faces a serious diversity problem. As researchers Maisha Cherry and Eric Fitzgable recently pointed out, women still receive only about 28% of philosophy PhDs in the United States, and are still only about 20% of full professors of philosophy, numbers that have hardly bulged since the 1990s. And among U.S. citizens and permanent residents receiving philosophy PhDs in this country, 86% are non-Hispanic white. The only comparably sized disciplines that are more white are the ones that explicitly focus on the European tradition, such as English literature. Black people are especially difficult to find in academic philosophy. Black people or African Americans constitute 13% of the U.S. population, 7% of PhD recipients across all fields, 2% of PhD recipients in philosophy, and less than 0.5% of authors in the most prominent philosophy journals. Both my own experience and that of Cherry and Fitzgable suggest that part of the reason for this problem is that students are confronted with a curriculum that is overwhelmingly white and male. As Cherry and Fitzgable put it, white male students, quote, see faces like their own in front of the classroom and hear voices like their own coming from professors' mouths. In the philosophy classroom, they see almost exclusively white men as examples of great philosophers. They think, that's me, and they step into it. Students of philosophy are ill-served by a narrow ethnocentric education. Fixing the problem of philosophy's homogeneity is a matter of justice, but it also is about the very survival of philosophy as an academic discipline. Women and students of color are an increasing percentage of college students, and by 2045, whites of European descent will be a minority in the U.S. Philosophy must diversify or die. For all the geopolitical, philosophical, and demographic reasons I've given, philosophy departments in the U.S. need to increase offerings in not just Chinese philosophy, but in other less commonly taught philosophies. So how's philosophy doing in the process of diversifying the curriculum? A decade ago, among the top 50 doctoral programs in philosophy in the U.S., 4 offered courses in Chinese philosophy. We're now up to 7 if we include departments that cross-list courses by members in other departments. However, as you probably know, cross-listing a course in your department does not mean that students are encouraged to study in that area or that they are supported in the study in that area. Departments sometimes cross-list under political pressure and reluctantly. Even if we look just at the raw numbers, it would be a mistake to infer that we will continue to see slow but regular growth in Chinese philosophy. Some departments that previously had faculty specializing in Chinese philosophy, like Stanford, lost them. In addition, some departments that currently have faculty in this area, like UC Berkeley, are not committed to replacing them when they retire. Can't we do better than this? At the Minorities and Philosophy Conference on Non-Western Philosophical Traditions at the University of Pennsylvania in 2016, my colleague Jay Garfield, an analytically trained philosopher who's become a leading expert on Buddhism, suggested half-jokingly that any philosophy department that does not teach any of African, Arab, Chinese, or Indian philosophy should be forced to change its name to Department of Anglo-European Philosophy. I was taken with the idea and suggested that we co-write an editorial on this topic. It appeared in The Stone, the philosophy blog of the New York Times, under the title, If Philosophy Won't Diversify, Let's Call It What It Really Is. If you just Google Garfield Van Norden, you can find the complete thing, but here's an excerpt. We asked those who sincerely believe that it does make sense to organize our discipline entirely around European and American figures and texts to pursue this agenda with honesty and openness. We therefore suggest that any department that regularly offers courses only on Western philosophy should rename itself Department of European and American Philosophy. This simple change would make the domain and mission of these departments clear and would signal their true intellectual commitments to students and colleagues. We see no justification for resisting this minor rebranding, particularly for those who endorse, implicitly or explicitly, this Eurocentric orientation. Some of our colleagues defend this orientation on the grounds that non-European philosophy belongs only in area studies departments like Asian studies, African studies, or Latin American studies. We ask that those who hold this view be consistent and locate their own departments in area studies as well, in this case, Anglo-European philosophical studies. Of course, we believe that renaming departments would not be nearly as valuable as actually broadening the philosophical curriculum and retaining the name philosophy. We hope that American philosophy departments will someday teach Confucius as routinely as they now teach Kant, that philosophy students will eventually have as many opportunities to study the Bhagavad Gita as they do the Republic, that the flying man thought experiment of the Persian philosopher Avicenna will be as well known as the brain in a vat thought experiment of Hilary Putnam. The editor made us add Hilary Putnam's dates. So I felt a little silly about adding that. That the ancient Indian scholar Chandrakirti's critical examination of the concept of the self will be as well studied as David Hume's. That Frantz Fanon, Kwasi Wiredu, Lamedeer, and Maria Lugones will be as familiar to our students as their equally profound colleagues in the contemporary philosophical canon. But until then, let's be honest. Face reality and call departments of European American philosophy what they really are. So we thought, oh, this is fun. This editorial will, occasional little discussion. Maybe it'll, get some people thinking about it. That'll be nice. The next morning, they put it up at like 2 o'clock in the morning. When Jay woke up the next morning, he said he had emails in his inbox saying, without any explanation, just, Jay, are you okay? Do you need anybody to talk to? Right? How are you feeling? And he literally said, not to be morbid, but he literally said, I thought, oh my God, his mom died? Has my mother passed away or something? What awful thing happened to me? And he finally said, well, why are you asking? He's like, did you see the post? The editorial produced a storm of controversy. The previous 5 essays in the Stone averaged 277 comments per article on the website. Our piece received 797 comments before replies were closed 12 hours later, and over 30 websites commented or hosted discussions. My own college-age children were most impressed that we got a thread on Reddit. The replies were inordinately passionate for what's essentially a discussion of academic curriculum. Now, some regarded the movement toward multiculturalism in philosophy as an obvious step. Patricia McGuire, who is president of Trinity College in Washington, posted and said, the venerable canon of the liberal arts is largely built upon the hegemony of Western, European, and British writing, art, culture, and perspective. Many faculties, including ours at Trinity in Washington, have done great work over the years, transforming courses and curricula to include many more voices and contributions from a remarkably broad range of cultures and traditions. These changes have strengthened and enriched the entire liberal arts curriculum, making it more open and accessible to a significantly more diverse generation of students. Let's face facts. There's a Muslim mayor in London, signifying the fact that even those who revere all things British need to catch up with the now settled reality of great diversity in contemporary life. The canon of learning should reflect that, including philosophy. But the reason Jay's friends were emailing him, asking him if he were all right, was that most of the 797 comments were not friendly and supportive like this. Most were like this one. Sure, name the departments in a way that accurately reflects the content and teach global thought traditions. But for better or worse, there's a particular school of thought that caught fire, broke cultural boundaries, and laid the foundation of modern science. Does anyone want to fly in a plane built with non-Western math? And our least oppressive governmental systems. I think this person hasn't heard of zero. Yeah. This makes one particular school of thought an appropriate foundation for the study of other schools. One more example of a typical comment: please preserve us from your political correctness. There's much that is of historical interest and value in non-European philosophy, but come on, there's a reason that Europe leaped ahead of the rest of the world. I do not believe that we should sacrifice that merely because of an ushy-gushy need to pretend that all cultures are equally advanced. Now, the critical comments that I just read suggest that non-European philosophy is somehow not as good as European philosophy. Most contemporary Western intellectuals gingerly dance around this issue. But the late Justice Antonin Scalia was an exception, saying in print what many colleagues actually think or whisper to like-minded friends over drinks at the faculty club. In the majority decision in Obergefell v. Hodges, the Supreme Court decision that legalized gay marriage across the U.S., Chief Justice Anthony Kennedy quoted both Confucius and the Roman philosopher Cicero on, quote, the centrality of marriage to the human condition. In his dissenting opinion, Scalia chided Kennedy for daring to invoke the Chinese sage. The Supreme Court of the United States has descended from the disciplined legal reasoning of John Marshall and Joseph Story to the mystical aphorisms of the fortune cookie. He echoes this sentiment in the conclusion to the dissent: the world does not expect logic and precision in poetry or inspirational pop philosophy. It demands them in the law. The stuff contained in today's opinion has to diminish this court's reputation for clear thinking and sober analysis. Notice that Scalia said nothing that might be interpreted as an aspersion upon Cicero. Only Confucius earned his contempt. Ironically, Confucius is featured on the east pediment of the Supreme Court building, along with Moses and Solon, as representing three of the great legal and moral traditions. Now, it's not only right-wing jurists who impugn non-European philosophy. Many philosophers, including ones who might describe themselves as politically progressive, are also dismissive of it. Massimo Pigliucci, an analytic philosopher of science at CUNY City College, wrote an essay online entitled "On the Pseudo-Profundity of Some Eastern Philosophy." He says some, but if you read the article, there's no indication in the book, as there's no indication in the body of his essay that he sees any limitations to his claims. This, what I'm going to read, is interspersed with comments from him. Quotations. Pigliucci concludes that there is no such thing as Eastern philosophy. And this is based on his exhaustive research, which he admits consisted of reading 3 koans and a Wikipedia article on Asian philosophy. Philosophy, Pigliucci explains, is inquiry conducted by the use of logical reasoning, where possible, informed by empirical science. Now, I don't know about you, but if I had a philosophy graduate student who threw around words like logical reasoning and empirical as if they were unambiguous and uncontroversial, and as if it were easy to identify whether a claim was empirical or not, or used logical reasoning or not, I would start him or her on a remedial reading list, which would, among other things, would include Pierre Duhem, Gaston Bachelard, Thomas Kuhn, Jean-Francois Lyotard, Paul Feyerabend, Michel Foucault, W.V. O'Quine, Wilfrid Sellers, Donald Davidson, and Richard Rorty, for starters. Now, Pigliucci continues that, quote, Buddhism, Taoism, and Confucianism, and so forth, are not philosophical in nature because they do not attempt to argue for a position by using logic and evidence. And of course, as we know from having taken formal logic, and so forth is a logical operator used to make precise generalizations from evidence. Finally, Pigliucci explains that in addition to its logical and empirical basis, actual, that is to say Western philosophy, quote, won't require decades of meditation staring at a wall. I would ask Pigliucci, or the ghost of Scalia, why he thinks that the Moist state of nature argument, why does he think that the Moist state of nature argument to justify government authority is not philosophy? Of philosophers who argue that human nature is good, whose account does he find the most plausible? That of Rousseau or that of Mengzi? Why does he dismiss Zhuangzi's version of the infinite regress argument for skepticism? Does he think that Sextus Empiricus's version of the infinite regress argument is philosophical simply because it is written in Greek? What is his opinion of Han Fei's argument that political institutions must be designed so that they do not depend upon the virtue of political agents? What does he think of Zhongmi's argument that reality must fundamentally be mental because it is inexplicable how consciousness could arise from matter that was non-conscious? Why does he regard the Platonic dialogues as philosophical, yet dismiss Fa Zhang's dialogue, in which he argues for and responds to objections against the claim that individuals are defined by their relationships to others? What is his opinion of Wang Yangming's arguments for the claims that it is impossible to know what is good, yet fail to do what is good? I'll discuss those arguments in my talk this evening. Does he find convincing Dai Jun's efforts to produce a naturalistic foundation for ethics in the universalizability of our natural motivations? What does he make of Mo Zung-san's critique of Kant, or Liu Shaoqi's argument that Marxism is incoherent unless supplemented with a theory of individual ethical transformation? Does he prefer the formulation of the argument for the equality of women given in the Vimalakirti Sutra, or the one given by the Neo-Confucian Li Zhi, or the one given by the Marxist Li Dajiao? Of course, the answer to each question is that those who suggest that Chinese philosophy is irrational or not really philosophy have never heard of any of these arguments because they do not bother to read Chinese philosophy and simply dismiss it in ignorance. Frankly, such comments remind me of the sort of undergraduate who doesn't complete the assigned readings, but nonetheless thinks he has some really cool ideas that need to be shared with the class anyway. My grade would be D-, C me. Now, if you're offended when someone says you're wrong, you have no business claiming to be any kind of intellectual, certainly not a philosopher. But there's a great difference between a sincerely reasoned argument and an unargued dismissal. As English clergyman William Paley lamented, is one of my favorite quotations, "Who can refute a sneer?" After all, as he continues, such attacks do their execution without inquiry. Much more of philosophy than we like to admit, I think, is simply what I like to call argumentum per supercilia, argument by raised eyebrows. You're studying Chinese philosophy? You think that Chinese philosophy is something serious? That's about the limit of the argumentation that's normally given against it. When people assert that non-Western philosophy is not really philosophy, or at least is not good philosophy, it's never because they've carefully studied it and have an informed and coherent opinion. I know this because anyone who bothers to learn about it with an open mind does recognize it as both philosophical and important. Another argument against multicultural philosophy appeared in the conservative journal, The Weekly Standard, in response to Garfield's and my editorial. This was one of several conservative journals or watchdog sites that critiqued our piece. This particular critique in the Weekly Standard argued that because philosophy is a word that is Greek in origin, it refers only to the tradition that grew out of ancient Greek thinkers. I'm reminded of the fact that when Freud developed his theory of hysteria, and this is actually historically true, some people objected to it by saying, no, rubbish. Hysteria comes from the Greek word for uterus. On your account, some men can have hysteria. That's impossible because men do not have a uterus, and the word hysteria etymologically comes from the word for uterus. Absolute gibberish, but that's the level of the argumentation. A similar line of argument was given in Eon magazine by Professor Nicholas Tompio, and And I've continued the discussion with him, and he's a very nice person. He's been very responsive, very civil in the discussion, but he still holds on to this view. And he pronounced that, quote, philosophy originates in Plato's Republic. That's bad news if you study Parmenides or Heraclitus, huh? I guess Socrates wasn't a philosopher either. In other words, the essence of philosophy on this view is to be part of one specific Western intellectual lineage. This kind of essentialist argument against the existence of non-Western philosophy fails for at least two reasons, one conceptual and one historical. First, the conceptual problem with essentialism. Whether people are engaging in a certain kind of inquiry, whether, for example, it's philosophical or scientific, cannot depend merely on an accident of history. Consider this example. The Pythagorean Theorem says that you have a right triangle with a right angle here. The square of the length of the hypotenuse, the side opposite the right angle, is equal to the sum of the squares of the lengths of the two adjacent sides. It's called the Pythagorean Theorem because it's often attributed to Pythagoras. The earliest proof of it that we have comes from Euclid's Elements. Now, as it turns out, the Pythagorean Theorem was also known independently in ancient China, and there's a proof of it in the Zhou Suanjing, an ancient Chinese mathematical work. And mathematicians who've looked at the Chinese proof said it's absolutely valid, and in fact, it's much more elegant than the one that you find in Euclid. So are we to say that, well, the Zhou Suanjing is not about mathematics, because mathematics is a tradition that goes back to people like Euclid? That seems patently absurd. If the Pythagorean Theorem were unknown in the West, the proof of it from the Zhou Suanjing could be translated into English and would pass the muster of any top academic journal of mathematics in the U.S. There are also clear historical examples of intellectual traditions accepting and being broadened by alien systems of thought. In fact, a very similar transformation occurred not too long ago when a major European university began to teach the ideas of a particular thinker who was outside the mainstream European canon. Now, mainstream philosophers on the faculty objected that this new philosophy was not part of our tradition. And they said that it was watering down the curriculum in the name of a fad. Because the new philosophy was inconsistent with many widely held beliefs, some philosophers resorted to a flaccid relativism, arguing that there were two truths on these matters. Now, this sort of approach only convinced the mainstream philosophers that the new philosophy was nonsense. However, a brilliant philosopher argued that the best way to discover the truth is through a pluralistic dialogue with all the major world philosophies. The philosophical genius was Thomas Aquinas. In the 13th century at the University of Paris, Aquinas, Albertus Magnus, and others encouraged students and colleagues who had previously only learned a Platonized version of Christianity to expand the canon and learn not just from the philosophy of the pagan Aristotle, only recently rediscovered from the Islamic world, but also from Jewish and Muslim thinkers. The result was to reinvigorate and deepen the Western philosophical tradition. Sigurd of Brabant, the infamous Latin Averroist, was the one who advocated the two truths doctrine. Interestingly, there are competing accounts of how Sigurd died, but I suppose each of them is true in its own way. The case of Aquinas and the rediscovery of Aristotle is just one of many examples that illustrate that the Western philosophical canon is not and never was a closed system. Philosophy only becomes richer and approximates the truth more closely as it becomes increasingly diverse and pluralistic. Now, the second reason that essentialist arguments against multiculturalism fail is that the definition of philosophy as a self-contained dialogue with the Greeks as the beginning is recent, historically contingent, and controversial view. Terrific book I recommend on the history of philosophy is Africa, Asia, and the History of Philosophy by Peter K.J. Park. As Park notes in his book, the view that philosophy's origins are Greek was in the 18th century, and he gives you plenty of examples of textbooks and other things from the 18th century to document this. The view that philosophy's origins are Greek was in the 18th century the opinion of an extreme minority of historians. The dominant views for most of the 18th century were that philosophy began in India, and philosophy was a gift of India to Greece. philosophy began in Africa, and philosophy came from Africa to Greece. Or, third major possibility, philosophy began independently in both India and Africa, both of which gave it to Greece. It was only a handful of marginal thinkers who had this crazy view that philosophy started in Greece. Now, even if it turns out, as a matter of historical fact, that philosophy did develop in isolation from Indian and African philosophy in Greece, that would not demonstrate that the latter were not philosophy. The important point to see here is it's not an a priori truth that philosophy begins in Greece. It's a disputable one. Furthermore, when European philosophers first learned about Chinese thought in the 17th century, they immediately recognized it as philosophy. The first major translation of the sayings of Confucius into a European language was done by Jesuit missionaries. And Jesuit missionaries had a substantial training in Western philosophy. They went to China, they studied Confucianism, they translated the sayings of Confucius into Latin, and they translated under the title Confucius, the Chinese Philosopher. One of the Western philosophers who read with fascination Jesuit accounts of Chinese philosophy was Gottfried Leibniz. He was stunned by the apparent correspondence between the I Ching, the classic of changes, which represents the structure of the universe in terms of unbroken and broken lines, essentially zeros and ones, and binary arithmetic, which he had independently developed, and which is, of course, the basis for all computers today. But what really impressed him about Chinese thought was its ethical philosophy. Leibniz famously said that while the West has the advantage of having received Christian revelation and is superior to China in the natural sciences, certainly the Chinese surpass us, though it is almost shameful to confess this, in practical philosophy. That is, in the precepts of ethics and politics adapted to the present life and the use of mortals. One of the philosophers influenced by Leibniz was Christian Wolff, who echoed Leibniz in the title of a public lecture he gave in 1721, Discourse on the Practical Philosophy of the Chinese. In this public lecture, Wolff argued that the Chinese showed us how you could have an ethics that was independent of belief in God. As a result, Christian Wolff got in a lot of trouble with conservative Christians, and he was hounded out of his position. But he became a hero of the German Enlightenment, and he quickly landed a juicier job. He had to bounce up to an even better position in another school. And a few years later, he gave another public lecture on the philosopher king and the ruling philosopher, in which he praised the Chinese rulers for seeking and heeding the advice of philosophers like Confucius and Mencius. It wasn't just in Germany that people took Chinese philosophy seriously. One of the leading reformers at the court of Louis XV was Francois Quesnay. He praised Chinese governmental institutions so lavishly in works like Chinese Despotism that he became known as the Confucius of Europe. Quesnay was one of the originators of the concept of laissez-faire economics, and he saw a model for this in the sage king Shun, who was known for governing by wu-wei, non-interference in natural processes. The connection between the ideology of laissez-faire economics and wu-wei continues to the present day. In his 1988 State of the Union address, Ronald Reagan quoted a line describing wu-wei from the Tao Te Ching, which he interpreted as a warning against government regulation of business. Okay, I didn't say every idea we got from Chinese philosophy is a good idea. So we got them. So through most of the 18th century, it was not taken for granted in Europe that philosophy began in Greece, and it was taken for granted that Chinese philosophy was philosophy. What changed? As Part convincingly argues, Africa and Asia were excluded from the philosophical canon by a confluence of two interrelated factors. On the one hand, defenders of Immanuel Kant's philosophy consciously rewrote the history of philosophy to make it appear that Kant's critical idealism was the culmination toward which all earlier philosophy was groping more or less successfully. So anything that didn't play into this story of philosophy developing into Kant wasn't philosophy or wasn't important. On the other hand, European intellectuals increasingly accepted and systematized views of white racial superiority that entailed that no non-Caucasian group could develop philosophy. So the exclusion of non-European philosophy from the canon was a decision, not something that people have always believed, and it was not a decision based on reasoned argument or empirical evidence about what Chinese philosophy or other kinds of non-European philosophy were actually like, but rather on polemical considerations involving the pro-Kantian faction in European philosophy, as well as views about race that are both unscientific and morally heinous. Now, I frequently teach the philosophy of Kant to my students, and I often say to my students, you're all, or almost all of you, are Kantians, whether you know it or not, whether you've read a word of Kant or not. Many things you take for granted about morality or human motivation or even epistemology, even if you've never heard the word epistemology before, are influenced by ideas that that come from or have their roots ultimately in Kant. And people who've been oppressed have often been able to use Kant's ideas as a way of conceptualizing the sources of the oppression and how to overcome it. So Kant is a very great philosopher, very much worth studying today. But we need to face the fact that Kant himself was notoriously racist. In his lectures on anthropology, which we don't read much today, but which were well known in his lifetime, Kant treats race as a scientific category, which it is not, and grades the races hierarchically with whites at the apex. These are direct quotations from Kant. The race of the whites contains all talents and motives in itself. The Hindus are just below the whites. They have a strong degree of calm and all look like philosophers. That notwithstanding, they're much inclined to anger and love. They are thus educable in the highest degree, but only to the arts and not to the sciences. They will never achieve abstract concepts. Right below that, the race of Negroes is full of affect and passion, very lively, chatty, and vain. It can be educated, but only to the education of servants, i.e. they can be trained. In another context, Kant said, something somebody said, this is a direct quote from Kant, "This scoundrel was completely black from head to foot, a distinct proof that what he said was stupid." Bottom of the list, the people of the Americas, the American people are uneducable, for they lack affect and passion. They are not amorous, and so are not fertile. They speak hardly at all, care for nothing, and are lazy. Kant groups the Chinese with the East Indians, claiming that they, quote, are static, for their history books show that they do not know more now than they have long known. So Kant, one of the most influential philosophers in the Western tradition, judges Indians, Chinese, Africans, and Native Americans to be racially inferior and hence incapable of philosophy. Is it a coincidence that U.S. philosophy departments do not teach Indian, Chinese, African, or Native American philosophy? Maybe. Because of Kant's racism, it's difficult to believe that his judgments on Confucianism and his lectures on physical geography are based on a rational assessment of the evidence. Oops, I'm sorry. I gave you that one. Kant said, "Philosophy is not to be found in the whole Orient. Their teacher Confucius teaches in his writings nothing outside a moral doctrine designed for the princes, and offers examples of former Chinese princes. But a concept of virtue and morality never entered the heads of the Chinese." He also breezily comments, quote, "In China, everybody has the freedom to throw away children who become a burden through hanging or drowning." Let's see how I'm doing on time here. Let's see. What do I have? Do I have until 3? 3:10, 3:15? Oh, 3:30? Oh, okay, great. For questions.
That's true. We want you to
Okay. So, all right. Kant's pretty horrible. Hegel's pretty horrible too. Take my word for it on that. I'll skip the awful things Hegel says. That one. Essentialist arguments against multiculturalism have continued into the 20th century. Martin Heidegger, although he flirted at some points in his career, he had more sympathy for non-Western philosophy. His ultimate view was this: the often heard expression Western European philosophy is in truth a tautology. Why? Because philosophy is Greek in its nature. The nature of philosophy is of such a kind that it first appropriated the Greek world, and only it, in order to unfold. Similarly, on a visit to China in 2001, Jacques Derrida stunned his hosts who teach in Chinese philosophy departments by announcing that China does not have any philosophy. In response to the obvious shock of his hosts, Derrida doubled down on his ethnocentrism. He said, philosophy is related to some sort of particular history, some languages and some ancient Greek invention. It's something of a European form. Now, it's true that for both Heidegger and Derrida, part of what they're saying is there's a particular vocabulary and language of being and views about language that only developed in the West. And so what they're ruling out is that other cultures that didn't have that particular linguistic and historical background had that. But this ultimately, I'd argue, is as condescending as talk of noble savages. It's basically saying, oh, well, yes, people outside the West, oh, how lucky they are not to have been confused by all these issues about logos and being that we have in the West. But of course, they can't participate in the philosophical discussion either. But they're so charming because they don't have these problems. Now, sometimes the narrow-mindedness characteristic of contemporary philosophy is amusingly baffling. I vividly remember many of my own early experiences being interviewed for a job as an assistant professor. The writing sample I submitted as part of my first job packet included an essay in which I discussed the fact that Taoists criticize Confucians in a variety of ways. One of the ways Taoists criticize Confucians is they say, well, look, if you're going to emphasize becoming a virtuous person like the Confucians do, it sounds good, but the psychological effect it's going to have is you're going to be the kind of person who talks about virtue, but then as soon as somebody doesn't respond appropriately, you're just going to roll up your sleeves and resort to force. Now, the notion that trying to become a virtuous person is intrinsically self-undermining because you end up becoming self-righteous is an interesting kind of theoretical problem. The Confucians say, well, that's why we emphasize things like humility and deference. If you're really trying to develop the right virtues, you won't have this problem. But I was interested to see what my philosophical colleagues would have to say about this. And I remember one very famous analytic epistemologist, this was the only question he had for me. The question was, so in all the pictures I've seen of Chinese philosophers, they're wearing robes. They don't have sleeves. Do these guys actually have sleeves? And I said that they did, and he seemed utterly fascinated to discover that Chinese philosophers had sleeves. That was it. That was the only question he had for me. During another interview, a philosopher asked a long, rambling question, which I could not reproduce most of it to save my life, and I don't think I understood most of it at this point. But at the end of this long, rambling question, the guy said, I'm not making this up, it was an actual interview I went on. So I guess what I'm saying is, it seems like the Chinese philosophers are playing the intellectual equivalent of minor league baseball, whereas Western philosophers are playing Major League Baseball. Wouldn't you agree? I did not, nor did I get that job. Now, the ethnocentrism of professional philosophers is sometimes too offensive to laugh at. Former philosophy doctoral student Eugene Park speaks movingly about his failed efforts to encourage a more diverse approach to philosophy. So he was a graduate student in a major philosophy department. I happen to know which one. He said, I found myself repeatedly confounded by ignorance and at times thinly veiled racism. To various faculty, I suggested the possibility of hiring someone who, say, specializes in Chinese philosophy or feminist philosophy or philosophy of race. I complained about the Eurocentric nature of undergraduate and graduate curricula. Without exception, my comments and suggestions were met with the same rationalizations for why philosophy is the way it is and why it should remain that way. To paraphrase one member of my department, this is the intellectual tradition we work in, take it or leave it. The pressure to accept and conform to a narrow conception of philosophy was pervasive. When I tried to introduce non-Western and other non-canonical philosophy into my dissertation, a professor in my department suggested that I transfer to the religious studies department or some other department where ethnic studies would be more welcome. Park eventually dropped out of his doctoral program. How many other students, particularly students who might have brought greater diversity to philosophy, have been turned off from the beginning or dropped out along the way because philosophy seems like nothing but a temple to the achievement of white males? The sad reality is that comments like those by Kant, Hegel, Heidegger, Derrida, Scalia, Pigliucci, and the professors Park encountered are manifestations of what Edward Said labeled in his seminal book, Orientalism. The view that everything from Egypt to Japan is essentially the same and is the polar opposite of the West. Said says that according to the Orientalist worldview, the Oriental is irrational, depraved, that is fallen, childlike, different. Thus, the European is rational, virtuous, mature, normal. Those under the influence of Orientalism do not need to really read Chinese or other non-European texts or take their arguments seriously because they come pre-interpreted. Orientals, for all practical purposes, were a Platonic essence, which any Orientalist or ruler of Orientals might examine, understand, and expose. And if you don't find that plausible, think back to some of the stuff I've said. So Massimo Pigliucci, as far as I can tell, a very good analytic philosopher of science, he says, I'm qualified to pronounce on the fact that Asian philosophy either isn't philosophy or is bad philosophy, because I read a couple koans and a Wikipedia article. And that's all I need to know. While racism is undeniably part of the problem, it's also true that most US philosophers simply don't know anything about Chinese philosophy. As my colleague Eric Fitzgable at Riverside laments, ignorance thus apparently justifies ignorance. Because we don't know their work, they have little impact on our philosophy. Because they have little impact on our philosophy, we are justified in remaining ignorant about their work. If US philosophers do have any familiarity with Chinese thought, perhaps from some non-philosophical survey course on Asian literature, it's probably from the Analects of Confucius, the Tao Te Ching, the classic of the Way and Virtue attributed to Lao Tzu, or the I Ching, the classic of changes. In my opinion, these are the least accessible works to any kind of Western training. And they're, in many ways, teaching them is a lot like teaching the Pre-Socratics. So when you teach the Pre-Socratics, there's interesting philosophy going on in the Pre-Socratic texts, but you usually need to give people a lot of guidance to see what's going on. And it takes a lot of technical expertise and linguistic knowledge to really do serious research on it. Nonetheless, they're important background for people you can read, like Plato and Aristotle, who almost anybody who's intellectually alive with a little help can read and say, oh, I see why this is pretty interesting. I might not agree, but at least I can see what's going on. And I think Parmenides is really interesting, but you just throw them at somebody without any background. You throw Heraclitus at the fragments at someone without any background, they're going to be confused. Same thing about reading the Analects or the Tao Te Ching or the I Ching. However, as Fitzgable notes, by even the strictest criteria, the ancient consequentialist Mozi and the Confucian virtue ethicist Xunzi are plainly philosophers. Fitzgable, himself a highly respected analytic philosopher of mind, goes on to note that the moral realist Mengzi and his anti-realist nemesis Zhuangzi are comparable in style to Nietzsche and Wittgenstein, and that they offer strong prima facie arguments, even though they do not write in the essay format favored by many contemporary philosophers. I would add the legalist Han Feizi and Shun Dao, who've been compared to Hobbes and the Machiavelli, to the list of ancient Chinese thinkers who are plainly philosophers. There are also many interesting and powerful philosophers in the later Chinese tradition, particularly in the Buddhist, Neo-Confucian, and New Confucian traditions. Remember, think back to those questions I gave earlier for Pigliucci or the ghost of Scalia. What would you say about this argument? What would you say about that argument? All examples of clearly philosophical arguments from Chinese texts from a variety of periods in Chinese history. skip a little bit here. So where do we go from here? As the Confucian philosopher Zhu Xi notes, ethical knowledge comes first in time, but appropriate action is what's most important. Consequently, I offer the following concrete recommendations to my fellow academic colleagues. The next time you're authorized to hire a new philosopher, consider whether it is really best for the long-term health of your department, for the education of your students, and even for the survival of philosophy as an academic discipline, to hire yet another person who specializes solely in Anglo-European philosophy. One bad argument I sometimes hear against diversifying the curriculum is, what would you have us cut? We barely cover Western philosophy at all. You're right. You can't cover all of Anglo-European philosophy. But guess what? You were never close to covering all of it anyway. There are more than a dozen distinct topical subjects in Western philosophy: aesthetics, applied ethics, epistemology, logic, metaethics, metaphysics, normative ethics, philosophy of language, philosophy of mathematics, philosophy of mind, philosophy of science, and political philosophy, among others. And there are at least 8 distinct historical subjects in Western philosophy: ancient Western philosophy, Hellenistic philosophy, medieval Western philosophy, early modern philosophy, 19th century continental philosophy, 20th century continental philosophy, history of analytic philosophy, and history of pragmatism. So if you want to have comprehensive coverage of Western philosophy, you will need a minimum of 20 philosophers in your department. In reality, even large departments in the U.S. do not try to have comprehensive coverage, but instead have philosophers with overlapping areas of competence. This is true. I checked this. I can let you know who it is if you're curious. One top philosophy department has 19 faculty members. So there you go. They should have one in each of these 19 different areas, right? In fact, 7 of those 19 people list philosophy of mind as an area of expertise. So they got 19 people. They said, we better sure we can cover Western philosophy, so let's get 7 people who do philosophy of mind. So yes, if you're going to add non-Western philosophy or some other less commonly taught philosophy to your curriculum, you will have less coverage in some area. But you are already making compromises about coverage all the time. Furthermore, scholars who teach some kind of less commonly taught philosophy almost invariably also teach and do research in some mainstream area. Chinese philosophy pairs well with ethics. Indian philosophy easily meshes with analytic metaphysics, epistemology, and philosophy of language. Many other less commonly taught philosophies are directly relevant to political philosophy. I once approached a leading philosopher for advice about how to increase diversity in the curriculum of U.S. philosophy departments. I deeply admire her and her work, which includes extensive activism as a progressive public intellectual, so I was hopeful that she would be supportive. She replied that given how few scholars know classical Chinese or Sanskrit well enough to supervise doctoral students, and how few students come into graduate school with any background in these languages, we can't change things without, quote, cutting corners. I can see that part of the reason for the glacial rate of change in philosophy is a pipeline. In a vicious circle, few institutions teach philosophy outside the Anglo-European mainstream, so there are few recent PhDs in these areas for institutions to hire, so the number of institutions that teach these kinds of philosophy does not increase. Now, although the pipeline problem is real, it's not an excuse for failure to diversify the curriculum. First, the Society for Asian and Comparative Philosophy, which is probably the largest professional organization devoted to the study of non-Western philosophy, has over 600 members. Consequently, there are enough strong scholars currently doing research in this area that we could double the number of top institutions teaching Asian philosophy overnight if there was simply the will to do so. Second, many understudied areas in philosophy do not require expertise in what the U.S. Foreign Service Institute describes as Category 3 languages, the most difficult ones for English speakers to learn. The Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. and Mahatma Gandhi conveniently wrote in English. Simone de Beauvoir, the seminal feminist existentialist, wrote in French. Enrique Dussel, a foundational figure in Latin American philosophy of liberation, writes in Spanish. Third, even if you cannot find someone with an AOS, an area of specialization, in one of the less commonly taught philosophies, you can at least hire someone with an area of competence in one of those areas who can teach the topic to undergraduates. What you should absolutely not do is go to someone already in your department who teaches Anglo-European philosophy but happens to be of non-European descent and say, we're getting pressure about teaching Asian or African or Islamic philosophy. Why don't you work up a course on it? Yes, this really does happen. This is deeply racist. It's as bad as saying that because I'm of Polish descent, I must love kielbasi and pierogies. I mean, I am and I do, but that's beside the point. Furthermore, untenured faculty will often have to swallow their pride and accept your request out of fear of losing their job by being uncollegiate. I actually know one, I won't say the school, but a leading school where they have someone who's really good at Chinese philosophy with a philosophical perspective, but is teaching it not in the philosophy department. They wouldn't cross-list this person's courses, but instead they asked a philosopher of mathematics in their own department who happened to be of Chinese descent to teach a course on Chinese philosophy. And so what she did was she went to the colleague in the other department who actually knows about Chinese philosophy and asked for her syllabus and just used that syllabus to teach the same course about the topic she doesn't know anything about, using the syllabus from the person who would easily be accessible in the other department, because she can't use her. I and many others have been fighting with rational arguments for decades to try to get greater acceptance of non-Western philosophy into the curriculum. I've appealed to my colleagues in philosophy to make moderate changes on their own terms in response to the realities of a changing world. However, I worry that they will continue to ignore the cries for greater diversity until they eventually end up being forced to diversify by outside forces, including pressure from students. If and when curricular change is forced upon philosophy departments, it will not be moderate, and it will not be guided by a deep understanding of what philosophy is about or what its intellectual standards are. This is why Garfield and I ended our editorial with this warning. We offer one last piece of advice to philosophy departments that have not already embraced curricular diversity. For demographic, political, and historical reasons, the change to a more multicultural conception of philosophy in the United States seems inevitable. Heed the Stoic adage, the fates lead those who come willingly and drag those who do not. Thank you.
Okay, so we've got 25 minutes for questions. I'm happy to field them. Or
you want to field them for me?
I won't field them for you, but I'll collect them.
Yeah, and that'd be easier if you field them. Yeah.
All right, so put your hands out and we'll go this down.
Yes.
So I'm going to formulate this question in a pointed way just to get your response.
Fine.
I wonder if you were arguing against what you call an essentialist argument against multiculturalism. It seems to be possible, however, that your own presentation is an essentialist argument of its own.
Okay.
Which is, look, there's philosophy in India, epistemology or logic. Look, there's virtue ethics in China. There's philosophy everywhere. So you seem, and again, I say this only elicit a response, you may be misunderstanding it. You seem to be suggesting that it's the very essence of humanity to be philosophical. And it doesn't matter where you're from, what language you're writing in, you are potentially a philosopher. So then it seems to me possible that you're really offering a kind of argument against diversity. It's not that different anyway over there. It's just we don't understand it and we dismiss it for terrible reasons, namely racism and prejudice of all sorts, which obviously seems to me to be true. I'm just curious.
Yeah, that's an excellent question. Actually, one of the things I skipped over because I didn't want to go on too long is a section where I address just this kind of concern. But let me just say what I say in that section. I don't think it's true that there has to be philosophy in any group of humans. You can find a group of humans that isn't doing something that we can recognize as philosophy. So I'm not making that extreme claim. What I am claiming empirically is if one actually looks at what's going on among Indian thinkers, it's immediately recognizable that they're interested in issues that we would call epistemological and metaphysical, and they are arguing arguments for them, and they are making distinctions to clarify positions, doing all the things we think of as philosophers as doing. If you look at the things that are going on in the Chinese tradition, likewise, you find people giving skeptical arguments that we recognize as skeptical arguments. You find people engaging in discussions about the nature of the virtues, the nature of living well, giving arguments for them, clarifying alternatives, and so it's clearly recognizable as philosophical. I think one thing that's helpful to do, and I think it's a methodological point, I recommend this, I think we should ban the word the from discussions of intellectual history and also comparative thought, the word the. Because as we know from Russell, the word the implies uniqueness. So if we say something like the Western notion of philosophy, or the Chinese view of the sage, or the Indian view of liberation, the implication of this weird word the, which you don't have in all languages in the world, but we have it in English and other Indo-European languages. The weird thing about this word the is it suggests uniqueness. Like there's one thing that has always been philosophy from Thales up through, say, Daniel Dennett. That's clearly not true. Socrates, Plato, Kant, and Russell do not have the same conception of what philosophy is. Likewise, there's no one thing which is the Chinese conception of the sage. Taoists, Buddhists, and Confucians disagree about what a sage is. There's not one thing that is the Indian conception of what you're being liberated from, what liberation consists of, and what you're being liberated into. And so you have these diversities, and then if you compare them, if you say, well, if you look at Mengzi, this interesting Confucian philosopher, if you compare him to Descartes, they're doing really different things. And there's not too much interesting to be said about, well, what might Mengzi say to Descartes, or what might Descartes say to Mengzi? I don't think there's too much you could say. But if you say, what could Mengzi, or somebody who took Mengzi's ideas, what would they say to an Aristotelian, and what would an Aristotelian say to Mengzi? If you actually read Mengzi, and you say, oh, I don't see what that has to do with virtue ethics at all, or living well, or virtues, or ways of cultivating ethics, I really don't know what to do with you. You got to be joking if you actually read Mengzi and you say there's nothing to do with virtues, or cultivating virtues, or living well. Or if you look at Descartes, and you say, well, I'm going to compare him to Dharmakirti, who is interested in some of the same epistemological and metaphysical issues that are bothering Descartes, and you're going to tell me, oh, these guys, there's no sense in which there's an interesting similarity in their projects. There transparently is. It's not even hard once you look at it. And that's why I say, I know it seems like an extreme claim, but I mean it very seriously, anyone who actually bothers to look in detail, does more than just reads a Wikipedia article, or, well, I've heard that, or, 30 years ago I took a survey course on, Asian literature. It didn't seem very philosophical to me. You actually bothered to read it, you clearly find things that are similar. But you're right, it's not that, there has to be something that's philosophical in a community. It's just that, as a matter of fact, there is.
Well, yeah, I wouldn't make that claim that every community has philosophers, but your phrase is interesting similarity and clearly recognizable.
Right.
If something's clearly recognizable, how different could it possibly be?
It can, I don't know, are Plato and Kant both clearly recognizable as philosophers? Yes. Are they very, very different? Yes.
So very, very different. I guess I'm wondering what that means.
But what does it mean in the case of Plato and Kant?
Really well, it's just vast. If I were to say, I think you were guessing in your 700 responses, this one, there's vast diversity in the Western tradition, which I think is a very good suggestion on your part. It's fair to say it should be renamed. That seems to me quite right. There's vast diversity. As you pointed out, we can't manage that diversity in most philosophy. So the diversity that would be affirmed by including Chinese and Indian philosophers wouldn't really fundamentally change anything. It would just broaden. It would make it more diverse, and it's already diverse.
Now, I'm not sure where you're going. Is that an argument for not including?
No, not at all. I mean, it's just sort of a principled notion about the word philosophy used so often. You're finding philosophy everywhere, and you recoil if anyone says, no, philosophy is Western. And that strikes me as a way of, it's just really a question. It seems to me that your view is that so many of the great thinkers of India and China are philosophers, which is to say, they're really not that different from Kant. They're easily recognizable as philosophers.
Okay.
So reason to include them, of course.
Right, right. Well, I mean, yes, like maybe we're agreeing. I mean, again, if you say, if somebody said, well, look, consider the following claims. If somebody said, well, isn't it obvious that Kant and Plato were both philosophers? I think we'd all say, yeah, of course they're both philosophers. So they really can't be that different then. Oh, no, they're very, very different. And if you're a Kantian, you couldn't learn anything by reading Plato, right? Oh, no, of course you could learn a lot of things. You might agree with it, but of course you'd learn it. So if somebody says that's what it's like with reading Aristotle and Mungza, that, they're clearly both recognizable as philosophers. So they're really not different. Oh, no, they're really different. And so Aristotelians could learn from Mungzians, Mungzians could learn from Aristotelians.
First off, I'd like to just say thank you for coming in and sharing your time.
Thank you for coming.
So my question follows from one of your last statements about being dragged along. It's really a pragmatic sort. And I kind of see it as there being two different problems. If we take the term that we have the soft problem.
Okay.
The soft problem, I understand, to broaden proportional diversity. You category. But I see a harder problem. The harder problem is how to ignite deep multicultural interaction with influence. Are you arguing that changing the proportions will change the conversation? And if not, then what is the extra variable that would solve the hard problem that isn't accounted for in solving the soft problem?
Yeah. When I started, I've gone through several stages in thinking about this issue. So when I started studying Chinese philosophy, one of the reasons I went into it, I was both already intrinsically interested in Chinese culture, but one of the reasons I went into it is I recognized there were very few people doing Chinese philosophy, and I naively thought, there's so few people doing Chinese philosophy, it's going to be so easy to get a job in Chinese philosophy because almost nobody does it, and it's so interesting. It's like, I'm not going to have to worry. Because people are telling me, it's going to be hard to get a job in philosophy. Well, you understand, I'm doing Chinese philosophy. It's going to be pretty easy, I think. And of course, I discovered, no, it's absolutely the opposite. It's almost impossible to get a job. And so when I finally got lucky and found an institution, Vassar, that was open-minded enough to actually hire somebody doing Chinese philosophy, a large part of my career became about trying to educate colleagues at various institutions to convince people that Chinese philosophy was philosophy, to show why it's interesting to philosophers, to encourage people to expand the curriculum to include it, to help people who are trained as mainstream philosophers to teach things that they weren't necessarily trained to do. But I found, and every few years, someone who had recently discovered Chinese philosophy would email me and say something like, a mainstream philosopher would email me and say, I just found out about Chinese philosophy. I started reading. It's fascinating. I was like, wow, this is really going to take off very soon. Obviously, when people find out how exciting Chinese philosophy is, everybody's going to be studying it. And eventually, I got to the point where I was very cynical, and I said, I wish that were true, but I've been doing this for 20 years, and there's no sign of anything changing. We're not going anywhere. So I wish it was true, but no, we're not going anywhere. In the last few years, I have finally started to feel like things are changing. I think part of it is younger philosophers are more open-minded than many philosophers in older generations. And that's not, I'm not universalizing. I have some colleagues, again, like my friend Jay Garfield. Jay was an analytically trained philosopher, did cog-sci, logic, philosophy of mind, those are his areas. And a student walked into his office and said, would you supervise a senior thesis on Tibetan Buddhism? And Jay has a great story about this. He says, he literally said, that's funny. That's funny. Okay, who put you up to this? Is it like one of those like new guy kind of things, like if they get paid a student to come in and say something goofy? And he's like, no, I'd like you to supervise my dissertation on Tibetan Buddhism. And so Jay, wanting to be collegial, agreed to supervise it, and he started to learn about Tibetan Buddhism. And he said, oh my God, this is clearly philosophical and very, very interesting, but not the same, but very, very interesting philosophically. So there are some older people who do it, but by and large, I find it's younger philosophers who are more receptive, and more of them, even if they're not doing non-mainstream philosophy themselves, they're open to it. So I think part of what will change is just a generational change. Just all these young people coming in who are more open-minded about these things. And so that just institutional factor, I think, will start to change things. And it's also, like I say, that what I actually think is going to happen is a lot of it's going to be external pressure the places that are more likely to have people doing non-Western philosophy or less commonly taught philosophy are state schools because they're more responsive to student pressure. And so Jay Garfield is teaching a course on Yogacara Buddhism in the divinity school at Harvard. And they won't cross-list it in the philosophy department. He's got a philosophy PhD. He's teaching a philosophy course. It just happens to be in the div school. They won't cross-list it. Why not? They're Harvard. They don't have to. But I think the student pressure is going to become more and more, and gradually it's just going to force departments to change. I wish they would change before that student pressure comes because it's going to happen. It's going to be sudden and catastrophic. And then what's going to happen is they're going to force departments to hire people quickly. They're going to force them to hire people who may not be of the best quality. They may force people to hire according to racial quotas or something. I mean, obviously, I think there are lots of great people who happen to be Chinese doing Chinese philosophy. But I think also you could be a white guy and you could be doing great Chinese philosophy too. I could be an African American and be doing great Chinese philosophy too. But once student pressure gets involved, they may be making all kinds of demands that may not reflect things that if you were a philosopher, you might make a different choice than what the student pressure would lead you to make. So I hope it doesn't get to that point, but I think that's what will solve the real hard problem, the institutional kind of problem, is it's going to be student pressure, honestly. Yeah.
This is inside Harvard's philosophy department.
Okay. So they're narrow-minded about a bunch of things, not just Buddhism.
It's a long story
Okay.
about how they view themselves as but with regard to David's point, and then the question, I don't think so. The way you presented it is as if by saying something isn't philosophy, you're saying it's not worth taking seriously or through.
No.
No, but I'm saying your critics, the people who write letters to you.
Yeah.
So, Justin Smith has this interesting distinction
Yes.
between thinking about philosophy as a ballet versus
Yes.
thinking about philosophy as dance.
Mm-hmm.
And I think one could perfectly reasonably say, or it's a point worth investigating,
Yes.
whether what we talk about as philosophy is distinct in the way that ballet is distinct from other kinds of dance forms,
Yes.
or it's distinct in the way dance is from drastically different.
Yeah. From eating or
Or it's all ballet. So,
Yeah.
And the worry is that in claiming it's all ballet,
Mhm.
you make it all the same
Yeah.
in a way that
Yeah.
doesn't keep what's really interesting.
Yeah.
So I think that's part of what
Yeah.
David was saying.
Yeah.
The second one was just, with regard to your mathematics analogy, I can imagine someone listening to your talk and then saying, well, okay, you're absolutely right. There's no question. Zero proofs, etc. But this is a convincing argument to me that Chinese philosophy and other forms of non-Western philosophy should be taught as the history of philosophy, not as philosophy.
Okay.
Because, in the case of mathematics, the analogy of mathematics, after Descartes and Gauss, mathematics is, until very recently, primarily a European form. The enormous developments internal to mathematics. And so when we look at a proof that's very interesting, like the Euclid proof, master zero, we're doing the history of mathematics.
Okay.
And it's the same when we teach a class in non-Western, in this case, Chinese philosophy.
Okay.
It's like history philosophy. Absolutely. It should
Yeah.
be included as many areas of history of philosophy. But that's different from claiming this is a contribution to contemporary philosophy. No, I have no doubt elitism is a counterexample. But it doesn't seem to me entirely unreasonable.
Okay. Two good points. Answer the second one first. What is your stance on teaching Descartes? Yeah.
Which stance on?
Well, so in other words, if it's so, then just it's worth to teach.
It's history of philosophy.
That's fine. That's fine. So, but then we should also teach the history of Chinese philosophy.
Agreed. No,
Okay,
I agree
great.
completely. But that seems to me a different kind of argument than the argument that
Does Descartes inform? Do you think he can inform contemporary debates on philosophy of mind, or merely historically?
I'm a historian.
Okay. Well, if you're thoroughgoing about that, about Western philosophy, then fine. As long as you treat Chinese philosophy exactly the same way, that's fine. But then you'd say, oh, okay, but we should be reading Li Zihe. Right, and you haven't because they don't teach contemporary Chinese philosophy either.
Agreed. That's very, very reasonable. I'm saying that with regard to Zhuangzi and all sorts of other people.
Right. They should be taught like we teach Plato and Aristotle, exactly. And then depending on your stance about the history of philosophy, if you're a strict historicist, you can say, well, it's just, it's in the past, it's not relevant to contemporary debates, or you could say, well, Descartes is relevant to contemporary debates, Aristotle is relevant to contemporary debates, likewise, Mengzi is, Dharmakirti is, depends on, but as long as you're consistent about that. Regarding the other point, Justin Smith has this great book, The Philosopher History in Six Types, and one of the things he says is, well, one way of thinking about it is philosophy like ballet, and that's a particular kind of dance. You're not denigrating another kind of dance by saying it's not ballet. Ballet is a particular kind of dance that has a particular relationship to a historical and cultural context. Or is philosophy like dance, where it's a very, very common thing people do in different sorts of styles. And my understanding of what Smith said was philosophy is more like dance. And he's right. Because that's an empirical question. You're right, it's a very interesting question. Is philosophy more like ballet? Is it more like dance? If you actually look at the evidence, it's more like dance. And what bothers me is, we have these interesting theoretical questions. Well, what if it turned out that they don't have philosophy in China? That would be interesting. It turns out they do. If you actually look, they do. What if it turned out they didn't have philosophy in India? That would be interesting. Turns out they do, if you actually look. What if it turned out that philosophy is parochial to the West? Turns out it's not, if you actually look. Point of fact. And again, it all comes down to, if you look at the stuff and you tell me, well, Van Norden, you just completely misunderstood what Zhuangzi is doing. That's not a skeptical argument, an infinite regress skeptical argument. Okay, let's talk about that. Read the text and we'll argue about what it is. Or, oh no, the Mohists are not giving a state of nature argument. It might look blindingly obvious like they are, but somehow they're not. Okay, read the text and we'll argue about whether it's a state of nature argument. But you look at them on the surface, or even deeply, no, that's a state of nature argument. This is an infinite regress argument for skepticism. Those are things philosophers do. And their versions sometimes are better. I think Zhuangzi's version is better than Sextus Empiricus' and clearer. Much better, much more clear.
We've got just about 5 minutes left. Still 4 people on the list, so we try to keep it quick.
Yeah. So I have 2 parts. Maybe I will say the second part. So what seems left out here is that for all the talk about philosophy being born out of Pre-Socratics, it seems like it has and so when I hear you, I assume
It wasn't NYU, but that's another good example.
but do you see that as like the source of the problem? It seems to me that the so-called in that there's sort of this maybe this conversation there seems to be some type of conceptual philosophy called out. It's also historical. That needs to be
I mean, you're right. Just give a quick answer.